Hello and welcome. Thank you for stopping by today. We are back again. We're going to be talking about Zimbabwe's identity crisis. My question to that is, do we stand for anything anymore? Every nation has a spine. Every nation has a soul. Every nation has a guiding idea. Zimbabwe, what do we stand for? Today, we're talking ideology. What is our ideology? What is an ideology? An ideology is a system of interconnected beliefs, values, and ideas that provide a blueprint for understanding society, its problems, and its desired future. Ideologies shape political, economic, and social structures. They influence everything from policy to national identity. Ideology is more than just slogans. It's the guiding light, the Eastern Star. It's the GPS of a country. Ideology says, this is what we fight for. This is what we won't compromise. But Zimbabweans, I have to ask you today, and I know everybody, each and every one of us has this question lingering in the back of their minds. For some, it's even on the forefront. What happens when a country believes in nothing at all? Does our country of Zimbabwe believe in anything at all? Better yet, do we believe in anything meaningful today? For without ideology, policy becomes chaos. Politics become survival. But Japan achieved some incredible government-led high growth in almost 20 years after the Second World War. From 1955 to 1973, what Japan achieved wasn't just luck. It wasn't just one person either. It was a deliberate investment in human capital, strategic industrial policy, plus a focus on long-term sustainability of the country of Japan, not that of a political party or a few people like we have in Zimbabwe today. Vision and discipline can help shape a country's ideology, especially in building industries, fostering innovation, and creating institutions that work not against the people, but for the people. Not a select few people, but for everybody. That's what Japan did in those 20 years when they were building up. China has done it. Without ideology, policy becomes chaos. Politics become survival. There are countries that have actually adopted some very good ideologies, have in fact achieved great results from the ideologies they have adopted. Some have adopted bad policies and ideologies, and we will see. I have a few countries that I want to discuss and look at their policies and see how those policies helped them to move from point A to point B or achieve that which they set out to, and how the efforts were concerted in such a way that everything just dovetailed, and within a short space of time they were able to realize the results. I'm going to start talking. The first country I'm going to start with is Japan. Just after the Second World War, remember, they got the atomic bomb dropped on them. They were devastated, terrible human life loss. But they did something else. They came back. They really bounced back. From around the mid-50s to almost the mid-70s, a period of about 20 years or some, they implemented a government-led high-growth ideology, basically. And they achieved some incredible results, which were not just because of luck, but because of that effort that they implemented, it just wasn't one person who achieved this. It was a deliberate investment in human capital, strategic industrial policy, and focus on long-term sustainability of the country, not a political party or a few people like we see in Zimbabwe, where our development is supposed to be predicated on just a particular group of people and led by a particular person. We've heard so many people in Zimbabwe that sympathize with said political formation, that they say things like Zimbabwe is going to succeed only if they are led by A. Zimbabwe is going to succeed only if they are led by a particular group of people. And I think that's really absolute hogwash. It's rubbish. For if we cared about Zimbabwe, we would ensure that we adopt an ideology in which everybody that is educated in the Zimbabwean education system, that grows up in the Zimbabwean society, that goes to Zimbabwean churches, that goes to Zimbabwean companies, industries, whatever, they are equipped with that ability to participate in the growth of the nation, just like what Japan did. This wasn't magic. This wasn't anything but strict ideology, industrial policy implementation, long-term sustainability. They had vision. They had discipline. And that shaped up to be an ideology, especially in building industries, fostering innovation, and creating institutions that worked not against the people, but for the people. Japan became a technological and manufacturing powerhouse, not by happenstance, but by close coordination between government and businesses and keiretsu. Keiretsu refers to industries that collaborated closely instead of rivalries, instead of taking each other over, hostile takeovers, I guess, or political leaders becoming jealous of somebody's success and then wanting a piece of that, and that person refusing or corporation refusing, and then they would just take it anyway. So they created an environment of stability for businesses to grow. It was conducive for businesses of all kinds and sizes to grow. People were employed. High employment led to high savings. And it was during this period that they were even able to save more money. And those savings were then plowed back into the domestic markets at very competitive rates. So you see the difference between what Japan did to get out of the murky waters that they were in after the end of the Second World War, in which they were not on the right side of history. They had been bombed and they had Nagasaki and Hiroshima destroyed, but they came back, became a technological and manufacturing powerhouse, and built their economy. Zimbabwe, what do? We see that. We see industries, companies, whole industries have collapsed. Companies have gone bankrupt and closed off. I mean, there's so many things to this, but what it takes and what it needs is just a concerted effort, a collaborative effort by government and corporations and the public to say, this is what we want to do. We have agrarian mindset where we say farming will take us out of this situation that we are in, but at the same time, we have to be aware that farming is becoming more and more sophisticated if we are to combat the effects of climate change, if we are to increase our yields. The soil has been tilled over and over again, and chemical fertilizers, of course, they will increase yields, but we also need to do other things. Like if we decide to say agrarianism is what we're going to become, then we have to be able to invest in science, the science of crops, to develop new varieties, new strains of crops that are able to withstand these weather changes. We have to be able to create technologies that will be able to effectively predict the weather patterns and then work with the farmers collaboratively to ensure that they are aware of the weather patterns of any particular season and be prepared. So crop science, we need to work with scientists to figure out how to preserve and to bring back some varieties of crops, how to preserve our forests, how to ensure that we can increase yields without necessarily having to increase acreage. Those are the things that we need to develop a serious ideology, mindset, and apply money where our mouths are. If we decide to be that, we can decide to be a technological powerhouse, we can decide to be anything else. But we have to, it starts with us having a serious ideology, which we don't have right now, because the people who are politically connected are the ones who are literally milking the country of its money and resources, cutting off the profits or the wealth they get from these activities elsewhere to other economies, leaving the Zimbabwean economy cash-strapped, leaving the Zimbabwean people really at risk of hunger, disease, and you name it. And then we wait for other nations that have better ideologies to come in and help us by way of donations, loans, or sometimes they'll just look at us and do nothing at all because, again, the people of Zimbabwe, we are very resilient. We'll always find a way to survive. Japan did it. We can do it too. I'm going to look at other countries, in fact, in addition to Japan. I'll begin with Tanzania. It was during the time of Julius Mwalimu Kambarage Nyerere who instituted this ideology of Ujamaa, which is African socialism. This vision, Comrade Nyerere implemented it from the 60s to around the 80s. It was rooted in pre-colonial African communal living, which is also known as Ujamaa. Ujamaa means familyhood. If you are like me, you come from a traditional family, or your family has been around the Southern African region, which entails even from Tanzania, Kenya, Tanzania, well, those are east, but the southernmost, perhaps Malawi, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Botswana, Zambia, some parts of Angola, Namibia, you will know that there is this system of familyhood that we have. Some call it Ubuntu, and some just know it, that we have some of the largest families, extended families in the world. We know our cousins, the fifth cousin, twice, 3 times, 4 times, 7 times removed. We know all that. And our families are just large. And that's how it was before European colonization, which then broke people apart, beginning with these nations that they carved out of our kingdoms, the Muntapa, the Ndebele, Roji, Ndwandwe, Zulu, Lozi, arbitrarily drawn borders by these European nations broke families apart and created nations, separating families. And over the centuries or the decades, they then just ended up identifying more by family rather than by nation rather than by family. Although we shared so many things culturally, linguistically, and other aspects. So now, what we had before the Europeans came were families. We all have totems. We all have family names. We all have everything. That's what and we valued and value those things even up to this day. That's what Nyerere's vision was, as a matter of fact. Nyerere, with his Ujamaa familyhood ideology, championed self-reliance, rural development, collective agriculture, which is also known as villagization, and state control of key industries and egalitarianism. What this system sought to do was to reject Western capitalism and its rugged individualism, and it also sought to reject the Eastern Bloc Marxism or Leninism, as they were all, and other systems that were of foreign import. Ujamaa strongly centered on the African identity, and as I mentioned earlier, rural peasantry. It also championed moral or ethical dimensions, the equity and dignity of an individual. It also relied on, in theory, it relied on voluntary cooperation. And this ideology, it is an ideology that was put down, was imagined, put down, and implemented. So the results of which they were mixed. Anyway, the good aspects, the good outcomes of Ujamaa were that there were significant gains in literacy and primary health care access in Tanzania during that time. There was a very strong sense of national unity, and it also did very well to help avoid ethnic conflicts. It also benefited Nyerere. The international world began to see Nyerere as a man, and he was, as a matter of fact, a leader of good moral standing internationally. Had it really worked, this would have been like the Desmond Tutu kind of fame, where with his championing of, human rights, Ubuntu, forgiveness, and all things like that. Economically, it wasn't really a success, though. Regardless of that aspect, it still gave Tanzania an identity. It was a very good ideology that coalesced the people of Tanzania, made them to become united. They became peaceful, and they were educated. Now, the bad aspect of it, of course, unfortunately, are that there was economic stagnation and decline. Villagization, in theory, was supposed to be something that was, in fact, voluntary. But in actuality, it was forced often. It disrupted the lives and agricultural patterns of a lot of people. Then there was state inefficiency, red tape, bureaucracy, which went on to hinder production. And that decline in agricultural production output led to food shortages and ultimately dependence on aid. So in the end, the system was not economically viable. But you can see that this was a fantastic ideology that Comrade Kambarage Mwalimu Nyerere had in mind. Had there been less bureaucracy, had there been more smooth adaptation by the people, it would have absolutely been a wonderful system for people to actually live under. Then so maybe in Zimbabwe, what we do is we pay a lot of lip service to so many things. So many words mean nothing anymore, any longer. Words like patriotism, the liberation war, production. Because ultimately, when Zimbabwe tried to do the same thing, we went on ahead and got the land back from the descendants of the European colonizers living amongst us in the country who owned large quantities of land. When we got that land back, the haphazard nature of distribution, the bureaucracy behind, or even the unpreparedness of the people to till the land in order to guarantee a continuation of food production, security, there was, coupled by changing weather patterns, there was in fact a dip in output, and then there is this issue that everybody knows and talks about, and I don't even know how we can deal with this, that many people did not get the land, but the majority of those few that got the land, they were government ministers, their families and those connected to them, and they had so much land that they didn't do a lot of production on. So that was a flow with a good ideology, with a good idea, which many African countries, even up to this day, I hear so many of my friends from so many African countries talking about that this was a good idea in theory. In practice, it was horribly executed, and perhaps we need to revisit the land redistribution program and see if there's any way that we can actually redistribute the land in better ways, more efficient ways, and to ensure that our nation continues to be able to feed itself. The second country I'm going to talk about is Singapore. In Singapore, there was pragmatic authoritarianism. Singapore, during a period from the mid-60s to the 90s, was a developmental state. Was run as a developmental state. Under Lee Kuan Yew, the country prioritized rapid economic development above anything and everything else. They adopted this ideology that gave them guidance to become a highly competent, technocratic, and authoritarian state. They combined free market capitalism, which in turn opened up the market, the same market, to foreign direct investment, because if there's anything that capital flows to once, is an economy, an environment that is just ripe to make the investors money. So if an economy is on the up and up, if an economy is reinvigorated, if an economy has proper institutions and protections for capital, then capital is going to come into that country. That's what Singapore did under Lee Kuan Yew. So there was a massive intervention in strategic areas such as housing, savings, and many other areas. There was strict social control, though, which some would say was a trade-off. The people had limited ability to dissent. The media was controlled, and people literally were limited in terms of when to assembly, how to assembly, and other things like that. It wasn't necessarily a free state, but good things were happening meanwhile. So there was an emphasis also. People could rise, people could have better lives. There was meritocracy, and the society was strongly against corruption. So it was ruthless, but it was pragmatic. It had a very rigid doctrine. There was a fusion of capitalism with a strong state direction. There was, of course, a trade-off, like I said, a sacrifice of political freedoms for economic growth and stability, focus on efficiency and long-term planning. And if you look at Zimbabwe, we already have limited dissent. We already have authoritarianism. We already have control of the media. What we don't have is a trade-off that Singapore had. What we don't have is the ability, or is the protection for private capital, is the invigoration of the economy is the provision of an environment where capital would want to be. We don't have that in Zimbabwe. But we have everything else. The bad parts of it is what we have. We don't have the good parts. For if we have a benevolent dictator, if we have a strong leader, like I see that happening in Rwanda, we have a no-nonsense leader who is also strongly against corruption, then that means that the economy will begin to recover. Then the economy will begin to rise. And when it rises, we have more people employed gainfully. Consequently, people save. There's money available for industries and companies to borrow at competitive rates. And the people invest. You can save money. That money can be borrowed out. And then it makes interest for you. And the companies use it to grow their production outputs, buy better equipment and other things like that, and ultimately become a very successful nation. So what happened to Singapore during this period was that there was spectacular economic transformation. It had been a third world port, and it became a first world financial hub. The standards of living shot up. The infrastructure became so good. There was clean government, very low corruption, minimal. There was social scalability because it was a meritocracy. There was also ethnic harmony. It was managed though, but there was harmony amongst the ethnicities. So the good things that we don't have in Zimbabwe, all those things I've mentioned, I mean, some of them we have them because Zimbabweans inherently, we are good people. But then Singapore's success wasn't without some negative consequences. And here are some of them. I mean, I've mentioned already the loss of freedoms and civil liberties. But there was also limited, genuine political pluralism. There was a lot of social engineering aspects, which I'm sure were stifling to the people, to the Singaporeans. Then there is, when an economy rises, sometimes it does not necessarily translate to the real and experienced living and the real experiences of the people. It could be the economy itself is doing fantastic, but what if the people are not being paid enough? What if the cost of living isn't proportionate to what the people are earning? Then you have a high cost of living, inequality, and the Singaporean model was basically dependent on specific context. Singapore is not a very large place. Singapore is a small place. So it was, in fact, is applicable. Perhaps we can say it's applicable to a small place because they're the size of Atlanta in the United States, roughly a little larger than Chicago. So that model, that ideology would work in a country that's about the size of Singapore. The third nation that we're going to look at is Germany. And unfortunately, during the days of the Nazis brought about to Germany national socialism. Adolf Hitler's ideology spanned from around early 30s to mid 40s. Didn't last that long, but there was a lot of successes. Bad as they may have been, horrible and terrible as they may have been, but there was quite a number of successes. His National Socialism was a toxic blend of extreme ethno-populism, nationalism, which regarded the supremacy of the Aryan race as what to aspire to. And Hitler also championed totalitarianism. Hitler championed anti-Semitism, anti-communism. He embraced militarism, Lebensraum, which is expansion of the living space for the Aryans. And he came up with a bunch of pseudoscientific racial theories. He rejected liberal democracy and Marxism and managed to convince the people, especially those that worked with and around him, that certain groups of people needed to be exterminated as they were taking advantage of the people of Germany. Some did collaborate and cooperate with him. Some didn't. A myriad of reasons. And I am not from Germany, so I don't know exactly what the reasons they gave. Maybe some people were old, some people just were too young, or some people were not violent, or they didn't want to participate in any of that. So Hitler ran with an unparalleled emphasis on racial hierarchy and biological determinism. He managed to create a cult of the leader, Prinzip. That's what it's called in Germany. So what it did was this: it championed the use of terror and propaganda as the core tools, and glorified war and conquest to create living space for this race of people, whom he deemed to be the pure race, the best race on this planet. In his system, in Nazism, every group of people had their place, and every person had characteristics or traits, especially if they were white, Aryan, pure. Then they had the desired aspects to do whatever he wanted to do. So, I mean, this didn't have any good outcomes. There was no good outcomes in my book, only bad outcomes. As we already know, the Holocaust, systematic genocide of 6 million Jews and millions of others who have never been spoken about. There are many other people that perished due to the activities of the Nazis. The Gypsies of Europe, other races of Europe that were excluded from the Aryan nation. The Africans, in particular, the Afro-Germans, who were mostly descendants of African soldiers and German women from the First World War colonial occupation, especially in the Rhineland area. And these were subjected to some of the most horrendous treatments. They were sterilized forcibly under the 1934 law for the prevention of offspring and hereditary diseases. They were experimented on medically. They were denied education, jobs, and civil rights. They were placed under constant surveillance by the Gestapo. The ideology itself basically predicated itself on African inferiority. Nazism viewed Africans and depicted them as degenerates and primitive, and they propagandized people with that hogwash. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, warned against race mixing with Africans. African culture, literature, and art were banned, and they were also mocked, ridiculed. The colonial troops that were in the French army that were deployed in their hundreds of thousands, the West Africans and North African soldiers, to fight the Nazis. And after the war, after their 1940 defeat, the Nazis, that is, they had captured thousands of African soldiers, mostly Senegalese and other groups, but largely Senegalese. These were massacred. These captured, the prisoners of war were massacred. And the most notorious of these massacres was the Chesley massacre, where these black POWs were executed by Nazi soldiers simply for being African. Their white counterparts were spared. And at the same time, these POWs were denied protection under the Geneva Convention. They were used as forced labor under the most brutal conditions. They were subjected to racial abuse and starvation. And Hitler created an ideology that today there is a lot of people in the Western world that want to resuscitate it, to bring it back. There are people who romanticize this ideology and see themselves as a chosen group by a madman. They are people like that right today across the world, especially in the West. And these people today, if you ask them or go around their circles, you'll find out they want life on this planet to be dominated by the Aryan. Everything, every industry, everything, which is impossible. It's a pipe dream, really. But they are there. Know that they are there. The ideology spread as far as Italy with Mussolini's trial expansion over Ethiopia in 1935 to 41 period. So Hitler supported the war, this fascist expansion in Ethiopia. And he wasn't involved physically or didn't commit his troops, but he supported it ideologically. And between 50 and 80 million people died in the Second World War. And this war was literally linked to the Nazis. So that was one of the consequences, the negative aspects of this ideology. It brought upon this planet and those affected unprecedented human suffering, displacement and trauma, erosion of the rule of law and the basic human rights of people were literally the order of the day. So Nazism left the world with a scar, and we're still healing from it to this day. Plenty of people that died from the concentration camps to other neighboring countries in Europe to across the sea in Africa. They died because of this ideology. They died because Hitler and his people stood for an ideology and they wanted to see the world become theirs. There are other ideologies like the American dream. That's an ideology that everybody tries to attain. People in America, outside of America, try to attain the American dream, predicated on freedom and prosperity, free markets. Although, I mean, if we have to drill it down, you'll still find out that there are also some issues with the American ideology, which is inequality and systemic racism. They're all thrown in the mix. Then there is also the North Koreans and their Juche ideology. This ideology demonstrates that when ideology becomes isolation, disaster follows. The North Koreans have showed us that. But then there's also good ideologies like the Rwanda rebranding. You have recovery from genocide through unity, order, and control. And I would like to think that Kagame is somewhat of a, maybe not a full dictator, but is somewhat of a dictator who is benevolent at the same time for the benefit of his nation. So they are rising today because of that in Rwanda. What about us? I've spoken about Germany, Rwanda, the Americas. I've spoken about Japan, spoken about Tanzania. What about us, Zimbabwe? Zimbabwe was born in fire. We know that. There was bloodshed, which is one of the phrases that a lot of people who went to war or didn't but claim to have gone to war say. We died for this nation. We shed our blood for this nation. So we deserve to be obscenely wealthy. While even when the nation is going under, we still have to get the rights to do as we please with this country. That is exactly where we are without a normal ideology as a country. But we had an ideology when we went to war. What we were focusing on was liberation, the real meaning of liberation, education, land, dignity of Africans. That was our ideology earlier on when we were out there fighting against the Rhodesians. But I would say this, I would give the ruling party this. ZANU-PF managed to achieve under Mugabe especially to guarantee and provide an education for those that were free and wanted to participate in the education in the country. So education. We have all grown up, became wildly successful as educated people. But that also did go away. That faded. Perhaps with the departure of Robert Mugabe, or when we lost all that we stood for, when we could not stand for anything. Maybe that's why even those things that we had managed to achieve, had stood for, had promised and created an ideology around, maybe we lost them. as society completely went downhill, became morally bankrupt, I guess. So I would not have done justice to this if I don't mention real quick the descent into depravity, middle to late 80s, when we went through a very dark patch with the post-persecution of the Ndebele people of Matebeleland during Gukurahundi, which when asked, Robert Mugabe said it was a moment of madness. But it was at his behest that these events that occurred in Matebeleland, the loss of lives, and it was at his behest that they occurred. The events unfolded. So Zimbabwe is a nation that struggles really with ideology or definitions or identity. We just don't know who we are. We talk about revolutionary indigenization, but yet operate like a neoliberal society or nation. But then in addition to this, there is chaotic governance, there is corruption, and the government is highly extractive. The government is selling off the country to the highest bidder. In fact, the ministers and the people who lead this country, the people in the Politburo, are the ones who are benefiting by carving out pieces of land, selling to local people who are desperate to get a piece of land, or to foreign investors who come in with the big bucks, especially from China. Our current landscape, economic and political landscape, is very foggy. We cannot see where we're going. We pretend to not see where we came from. And arguably, this is characterized by just pragmatic survival tactics and national rhetoric. Than I wouldn't say it's a competent ideology, because it's not. People are seeking survival. The government ministers and leaders and the presidents and everybody are just on an extractive mission. They want to gain more money, to make more money. For what? Goodness knows. Now, even in the political parties, in my own observation, I feel like the ruling ZANU-PF comprises disparate groups making up, the entire body, but all of these groups, and going down to the individuals in these groups, all of them are self-interested. They are individuals who don't necessarily value or care for the party itself, but for what they can get. It's a degenerate system that we have, where patriotism is mostly spoken about, but rarely and hardly. Very few people are actually patriotic, even those that went to war for this nation. Somebody said that, some heroes, I don't know if this is the exact phrase, some heroes live long for them to turn into villains. That's what we've seen. The Liberation War heroes have become villains. They have become that which they went to war against. It was Chris Mutsvangwa who actually said, if the people who were calling for a change of government or for a better economy, a better life in Zimbabwe, if they wish to remove the ruling party from power, they have to do what they did. They picked up arms and went to war. And this man is a high-ranking government official, spokesperson for the ruling party, or some high-ranking official of some capacity in that party. So it really begs a question. Why are we still here debating, or in fact, we are not debating anymore. We are on social media fighting each other. There's a lot of young people, men, women, who are doing drugs now. There's a lot who are just wandering in despair in foreign lands where we are treated like absolute rubbish. And then what then happens is, in those countries where black people are treated so badly, our leaders, they go there, they don't fight for us, they don't demand better treatment for us from those countries. They go on there, they invest even some more. So it is us against them. They only care about their wealth and their escape routes when things go bad, or they look for ways to make more money caused by human suffering. and animal suffering. So we have to do away with a nation where individuals who are extracting from the government are then becoming the arbiters of what is and what isn't democracy. They become the people who tell us who is and who is not suffering, what is suffering and what is not suffering, all to block common sense voices calling for change, pain voices calling out for help. But the usual mechanism of dealing with such is to be heavy-handed. Send the police, send the soldiers, send the army, send everybody. Send other young people who want to make money for the next drug fix or some beer, or they're just disillusioned, or they're just being tricked. Send them to go beat that person up who is speaking. That's our ideology. The ideology of beating each other up, maiming each other. The ideology of slandering and then turning around and doing that which we slander the other person with. So I don't know what we stand for as Zimbabwe. We are becoming a nation where success entails not planning carefully, going into business, running a business efficiently. Success comes if you know people in the government, so that you do these dirty deeds or whatever it is, and then you get paid for that, which is quite sad. So you find that out of this confusion, out of this quagmire, politicians swear to follow one leader today, and then when that leader gets deposed, they quickly switch up and go to the next person that was their enemy before. Many politicians have justified that we took our land because we own the land. We had to take it back. The Europeans who came here took that land from us. But today, all that rhetoric is gone, and they are paying compensation to the farmers before the black people are given reparations or are paid back for the land that they lost. In fact, we believe in nothing. That's why everything and anything goes in Zimbabwe. We worship the rich and fear the powerful. We laugh at integrity and flee from this mess. And anybody that wants to get rich knows that they have to get into politics, that they have to suck up to political leaders. And that's the only way they can make it and not be able to even work, build their careers, because we still have people going to schools, graduating from universities, from secondary schools. But those people are turned into an economy that has no jobs, an economy that doesn't care about them. And many of them just end up leaving, going to other countries which are not very warm and welcoming, especially right now across the world. So you look back and think, what do our leaders really think about our nation when they see the world being shut out or shutting us out? And they sit there, no retaliation, or even better yet, no promise that things will change and be better in the nation. But it seems as if they're ramping up their extraction, ramping up allowing their friends to come in who don't respect the environment and nature of our country, allowing them to come in, pay them off, and go off to make destruction. So if we had to go back and take a look at what we had before, I mentioned it briefly earlier. The ruling ZANU-PF's party's foundational ideology was Marxist-Leninist nationalism. It was heavily focused on anti-colonial liberation, and initially they planned to do a socialist transformation. That is, early education, health gains. But then post-independence, we saw the chaos that ensued with that. So today, what's left are empty promises, the shells of the party that once championed people's development and rights as Africans, as black people. And what we have today are these zealous promotions of the liberation narrative as a source of legitimacy. Anybody that wants to be deemed legitimate has to give some stories about how they fought in the national liberation. If you want favors, survive in business, even make money. If you were a celebrity influencer, then you latch on to the ZANU-PF thing. You portrayed the political party as synonymous with the nation and its history. That's why I said earlier, Japan managed to attain all that it attained by not pinning all its hopes and all it had on just one political party. People came from all walks of life to do this, as long as they were competent. But in Zimbabwe, we have people literally saying that there is no Zimbabwe without ZANU-PF. This zealous promotion is untenable. And the opposition, whoever they work for, whether they work for themselves, whether they are being sent by somebody else, they are often framed as unpatriotic or neo-colonial. But when you think about it again, you'll see that it's everybody. It's not just the opposition. Everybody that dares to question the power structure is deemed that they hate Zimbabwe. So ZANU-PF relies on more than just patriotic nationalism, narrative, promotion. They also have a boogeyman, sovereignty, anti-Western rhetoric. This is drummed up every rally, every meeting that the people have with the politicians, especially of this political party. They tell them about how the West wants to recolonize Zimbabwe. They tell us, particularly the UK and the US. And they use this to deflect criticism and to justify some policies. And, they emphasize on Zimbabwean solutions, which never come. There's another tool in their tool bag to gain and retain that control of the people, of us. State control and patronage. I mean, the government is in every. They want praise. They want mentions. They want shout outs in every private sector led growth. They have significant control over key sectors, mining, media, and the parastatals that they run. Our Zimbabwean economy functions heavily on patronage networks, where we've seen loyalty being rewarded with access to resources, contracts, and protection. You can never get arrested. This is key. The system operates on a patronage, an ideological principle. We don't have ideology. Then there was that talk of indigenization and economic empowerment. Remember those policies that were enacted during Jonathan Moyo's time? Indigenization laws that were framed ideologically, but the implementation is always chaotic, and it always ultimately benefits the elites, the same people at the top who will be saying that we want now to distribute this wealth to ensure that everybody plays a very important part in the development of the nation. Then they don't. The benefits go to the leaders. So what we have is a country with a lack of coherent guiding ideology. We have policy inconsistencies. Our economic policies often appear reactive and contradictory, like the land program itself. If we were really serious about this, I'm sure we would have done some research to figure out who was going to be irked by our taking of the land back. And we would have probably tried to ameliorate the fallout, to reduce the fallout. But we didn't. We just went into it, seeing how much land was needed to be given to who, set aside for who, and many other things. But it was these elites, the shefus, that ended up with tens of farms, massive farms, where nothing was happening. So we then end up just reacting and sometimes contradicting ourselves. And we've seen the contradictions, like those abrupt changes, seizing of people's foreign bank accounts, price controls mixed with market rhetoric. We've seen immediate crisis management, political expediency being the go-to over long-term vision. I mean, we've had a vision 2020, which I don't think anybody cared about it 2 days after it was. But they aired commercials on the television, radio, and the paper. Now it's a new vision, 2030, I think. So there's a lot of space between rhetoric and reality. These proclamations of Pan-Africanism, socialism, people-centered development, they frequently clash with realities of corruption, elite accumulation, and service delivery. It's there, it's glaring. So what's said is one thing, in reality, what's there is another. And when people try to call over the attention of those that are speaking that rhetoric, they then deemed as sellouts. They're then deemed as enemies of the state. And we all know what happens to enemies of the state. So ultimately what I see with our country, without an ideology, without something, because if we really were serious, we would have put in place an ideology in which everybody that's born in this country, that comes to the country, that is part and parcel of the nation, even if they get into power or not, at every capacity, they'll have an ideology which would be automatically running, which people would automatically fall in line with. But what we see with ZANU-PF is just the regime puts a lot of its resources on survival. Much of ZANU-PF's actions appear primarily aimed at maintaining power through a mix of coercion, state security, co-option, which is patronage. We've seen people getting cars, celebrities, if they say nice things about the leader. We've seen people dancing at rallies, getting paid money. So it's not the right thing to go about. What are you being co-opted into? What are you being coerced into? I understand coercion because nobody would be willing to do that. But then there's also control of the electoral processes. Remember I think it died down, the story of the voters' roll, the sourcing of the voting materials being the tenders of which were awarded to somebody who's connected to the government, and then they invoice and a bunch of other things. So all this is done while ZANU-PF is leveraging the liberation legacy. This survival imperative often trumps any consistent economic or social ideology, because ultimately the reflex is to protect themselves. That's why after the recent elections, 2024, and when people were planning to protest, tanks were roaming out in the streets, driving, zooming by. People were told to stay at home. Some members of parliament even told people that they will be killed. This is where we are, in a nation that has no respect for the people whom they say they liberated from a colonial government that treated them badly, like in apartheid-like conditions. In apartheid conditions. And then only for that government to turn around and become a threat to its own people. So we have a constitution. The 2013 constitution enshrines values like democracy, rule of law, human rights, but implementation is really, really weak. We are not the operational idea. We are not there yet. The constitution is there as a document, maybe for other people, the povo, the hoi polloi, but not for the officials, because they could break the rules any day they want and remain floating above the law. So we are here, Zimbabwe, a nation that's just like a ship without a rudder, rudderless ship. And a lack of ideology always results in economic instability. There is no predictability. There is no consistency in our economy. There is no investment. There is deterrence of investment because of this unpredictability. It's difficult for people of Zimbabwe to even plan long term. We cannot. We've been experiencing hyperinflation. Ours was the largest. I remember back in 2008 when our economy was just out of control. We have had to change currencies several times. And very few people are employed formally. There is a lot of nationalist rhetoric that depends divisions between ZANU-PF supporters and the opposition, especially the urban populations. There are even divisions within ZANU-PF itself. Comrade Gezi, I don't know if he works with ZANU-PF or he was just doing it to pacify people, but it clearly shows that there are divisions. And there are so many WhatsApp groups where some people literally are choosing certain members of the party to be the leader, or it's a very sad situation. The institutions have been taken over. The judiciary, parliament, civil servants, the people you voted for to be your representatives, members of parliament, they do not represent you. They are looking out for themselves, for their own pockets, for the bellies of their pockets, as Chinua said. So now, how do you begin to even seek your freedom? How do you even begin to say you are independent as a nation when you have no institutions to support you? The institutions themselves are undermined. They're undermined by patronage and executive interference. Their ability has been eroded. They can't function independently based on constitutional or ideological principles, but mostly constitutional. And the politicians have become the bane of our existence in Zimbabwe. The patronage system, we know it fuels corruption as access to state resources. And this has become the primary avenue for wealth accumulation. Not production, not productive enterprise or ideological service, but just rent seeking, linking up with the people in power. It's a very, very sad situation. And then there is social fragmentation and disillusionment. The deepening poverty, inequality, and political repression has led to mass immigration and widespread of disillusionment, particularly among the young people who feel disconnected from the liberation narrative. The majority of us were born after that war, way after that war, but we're still being told about it to this day. If it was an ideology, the way people hear about the liberation war, the number of times, the frequency of which they hear it, if it was an ideology, then definitely we would be better off. But instead, it's a grift. It's a way to keep people in their positions, to say, by bringing, I'll say, even a sob story. The liberation war was important. And it's not only the people that are speaking, that are in charge today, that went to war. A lot of us, our grandparents, our aunts, our uncles, most of them came back. Some of them didn't come back home at all. So it seems as if with the ruling party, ZANU-PF, it seems as if they're the only ones. The 17 people in the party are the only ones that went to war and won that war single-handedly without the help of the majority of the people. It's a lie. And you know that they're just doing that so that they can stay in power. People have to feel like they owe them something. So we've been isolated by the international community when we took back our land, which we should have really done our homework to try and figure out what would happen. And the re-engagement ploy by the president at one point to say Zimbabwe is open for investment, but actions speak louder than words. There was no accompanying actions to say, if you invest your money in this country, these are the protections that you'll have. Investors, they look at the people, they citizens of the country to see if their property is protected. If it is not, then who is posing a threat to it? Who is putting it at risk? If it is the government controls everything. So that's not a good place to invest in because the risk is high. So we still hang on to this nationalist rhetoric, internal repression, but then the rest of the world is like, no, we're not going to go there. So this has impacted a lot. Aid and investment and the countries that used to render aid, the United States with their USAID or any other vehicles of aid, they are now not clearly coming out and saying we can't do that. You have to do to help yourselves. And I don't blame them. They literally had to. They literally had to maybe start helping their own people. But our politicians had become so comfortable, relaxed, because they knew where their shortfalls are. Then aid comes in and helps their people where they are unable to help just because they don't want to. Then aid comes on and fills that gap. Dambiso Moyo wrote that in her book Dead Aid. That's what most it's not just a Zimbabwean problem. It's basically an African or any country that relies on aid. The politicians just become, their brains atrophy. The thinking and creative part of their brains where they have to think of creative solutions to keep their people fed and protected just atrophies because and all they focus on is just to skim. If it's financial aid, they scoop, put in the pocket, and then just very little money gets to the intended target. So in conclusion, I know I've spoken for so long, I shouldn't. Next time I'll just try to keep it short and sweet. Ideologies, whether noble like Ujamaa's, Tanzania's Ujamaa, or abhorrent like Nazism, have profound power to shape nations. For better, like Singapore's transformation, or for worse, Nazis' devastation. Zimbabwe today operates in the shadow of its liberation ideology. Using this narrative as a powerful legitimizing tool, the politicians have found a way to remain in power. However, it is operational guiding principle. However, Zimbabwe's operational guiding principle appears to be a regime survival through a system of patronage and controlled nationalism, rather than a coherent, consistent socio-economic or political ideology, like we've seen earlier. The consequences are stark. Chronic instability, economic hardship, no medicine in the hospitals, institutional weakness, and social division, really. There is nothing unifying, nothing forward-looking in terms of ideology that genuinely prioritizes national development and citizen welfare over elite interests. That's the core part of Zimbabwe's contemporary challenge. That's where we are. That's where the challenge lies. It's been identified, Zimbabweans. Now that we've identified, like, what do we do? What do we do, Zimbabweans? Do we have an ideology beyond survival? What if today we begin to think about believing in something again? We can come up with it, be it Ubuntu, innovation, ecological stewardship, radical honesty with zero corruption, economic unity across Africa, dignity through work, respect for the land. We can do it. We don't need slogans, though. Let's do away with these slogans. These are the wrong things to adopt. Slogans are just mindless, brainless. We need a spine, an ideology rooted in who we are and who we dream to be. We are one nation. We don't even need to copy anyone. We don't need to try and copy Ujamaa. We don't even need to try and copy Singapore, and definitely not the Nazis. But we do need to believe in something again. I feel like it's time. This is the time that we need to rise up and use our minds instead of losing our minds. Because if we continue on this path without an ideology, we're just wandering, like wandering in the desert. It's been more than 40 years and we're still wandering. And you know what happens to people who wander? They don't build. So the onus is on you, Zim. My Zim brothers and sisters, let's do this. Thanks for stopping by. I'll see you next time again.